It is August the 5th, 2026, and somewhere off the coast of Oman right now, a cargo ship is sitting dead in the water with one crewman missing after being hit by a projectile overnight, and almost nobody outside the shipping industry noticed. That is the part of this story that should worry you more than any headline, because while that ship was burning in the dark, the President of the United States was telling reporters that talks to reopen the Strait of Hormuz were happening at that very moment, and Iran's own government was flatly denying that any such talks were taking place at all. Two governments, two completely contradictory stories, and in between them, a waterway that carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil still sitting at a fraction of its normal traffic 5 months after this war began. This is the story of what the United States Navy is actually doing in the Persian Gulf right now, why the numbers say Iran cannot afford another 6 months of this, and why the quiet disagreement between Washington and Tehran over whether they are even talking to each other may be the most dangerous part of the entire crisis. Let's start with what happened in the last 24 hours, because it tells you everything about where this conflict actually stands. According to the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, the British Navy body that tracks incidents across this corridor, a dry bulk cargo ship was struck by a projectile off the coast of Oman overnight. The crew was forced to abandon the vessel. One seafarer is currently unaccounted for. This is not a rare event anymore. It is the rhythm of life in these waters 5 months into a war that was supposed to have ended with a ceasefire back in the spring. At almost the exact same time, President Trump told reporters that the United States and Iran were in active discussions to reopen the strait, and said talks could produce results as early as this week. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baghaei, said the opposite. He said Iran has no plans to host foreign delegations or send negotiators abroad in the coming days, and that the only talks Iran is engaged in are with Oman, not with Washington. Hours after that denial, Trump called Iran's leadership unbelievably duplicitous and insisted Iran had itself requested a meeting. So which is true? Here is the honest answer, and it matters more than picking a side. Both things can be happening simultaneously. Iran's government does not negotiate with the United States directly. It never has, throughout this entire war. Every real conversation runs through intermediaries, mostly Oman, sometimes Qatar. So when Trump says talks are underway, he may be describing a genuine diplomatic channel that is running through Muscat, rather than through any direct US-Iran contact. And when Baghaei says Iran has no plans to send negotiators abroad or host delegations, he may be technically correct, while Iranian officials sit across a table from Omani intermediaries who are relaying positions back and forth between Tehran and Washington. This is not necessarily two sides lying. It may be two sides describing the same indirect process, using language calibrated for two completely different domestic audiences. Trump needs to look like a dealmaker closing in on a win. Iran's hardliners need Tehran to look like it never bent the knee to Washington directly. Both of those political needs can be satisfied by the exact same set of phone calls happening in Muscat this week. What we do know for certain is what Iranian officials are saying about the strait itself, and it is not conciliatory. Mohsen Rezaieh, a military advisor to Iran's supreme leader, said on state television that Tehran will not allow any shipments through the strait except along Iran's own stipulated route. That is not a negotiating position designed to end a crisis quickly. That is a demand that Iran retain a functional veto over global shipping through one of the most important choke points on Earth, dressed up as a safety arrangement. Iran's foreign ministry has described its parallel talks with Oman as focused on establishing safe inbound and outbound shipping routes, while protecting, in its words, both countries' sovereign rights and national security interests. Read between the lines, and what that phrase actually means is that Iran wants the authority to say which ships get through and which do not, permanently, as the price of reopening a waterway that belongs to no single nation. To understand why one struck cargo ship and one diplomatic argument matters this much, you need the full timeline, because this war did not begin yesterday, and it has never actually stopped, no matter how many temporary ceasefires have been announced along the way. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iranian military targets, an operation that killed Iran's supreme leader in the opening hours. Iran's response was immediate, and it defined everything that followed. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps closed the Strait of Hormuz to foreign shipping altogether, transmitting radio warnings to commercial vessels that no ship would be permitted to pass. Within days, Iran officially confirmed the closure applied to what it called unfriendly nations, while claiming to still allow approved vessels through. Shipping companies, unwilling to bet their crews and cargo on Iran's definition of friendly, simply stopped sending ships into the strait altogether. Insurance premiums for any vessel willing to attempt the transit spiked to levels that made the voyage financially irrational for most operators. What followed was months of escalation and partial de-escalation that never fully resolved. In April, after diplomatic talks in Islamabad collapsed, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iran, intercepting vessels, attempting to move in or out of Iranian ports. Over the following weeks, American forces seized several vessels outright and intercepted dozens more, while Iran retaliated by seizing 2 cargo ships of its own, including the MSC Francesca, whose crew is still aboard it right now. A temporary ceasefire in April briefly restored some traffic, but Iran continued asserting control over which ships could pass, and by early summer, its own parliament had voted to impose tolls on shipping and to formally bar American and Israeli-linked vessels from the strait entirely. In early July, during the days-long funeral for the assassinated supreme leader, 3 merchant ships were struck in the strait, and the United States responded with a fresh round of strikes against Iranian targets, a reminder that the so-called interim deal holding this conflict together has never actually stopped the fighting so much as it has lowered its intensity and changed its rhythm. It is worth pausing here on just how unusual this level of sustained naval commitment actually is by historical standards. The United States has not maintained 3 separate carrier strike groups cycling through a single theater for this length of time since the height of operations in Iraq and Afghanistan 2 decades ago. At the peak of this deployment pattern, total American naval presence across the region, according to figures released by Central Command, exceeded 30 warships at once, an armada large enough that military analysts describe the resulting air and sea dominance as achieved within roughly the first week of the campaign. Iran, for its part, lost dozens of naval vessels in the opening phase, including a converted drone carrier comparable in size to a World War II era carrier, along with damage to dozens of smaller fast attack craft that make up the backbone of Iran's asymmetric naval doctrine. That doctrine, built around swarming small boats, coastal missile batteries, and sea mines, rather than a conventional blue water navy, was specifically designed to make any large-scale American presence costly and complicated. 5 months in, it has succeeded in making that presence costly. It has not succeeded in making it unsustainable. That is the pattern worth understanding. This war has moved through cycles of closure, blockade, partial reopening, renewed attack, and renewed strikes again and again for 5 straight months, without ever reaching the point where either side fully commits to peace or fully commits to open warfare. The cargo ship struck off Oman overnight is not an isolated data point. It is simply the newest entry on a maritime incident list that, according to independent trackers monitoring the crisis, already includes more than a dozen damaged merchant vessels, several abandoned outright, at least 1 tugboat sunk, 2 ships captured, and more than a dozen seafarers killed or reported missing since the closure began. Every one of those incidents happened inside a waterway that, before this war, quietly carried a quarter of the planet's seaborne oil without a single headline. Now, here's where the Navy comes in, because this is the part almost nobody is connecting properly. People keep asking where the 3rd carrier is, when the next strike is coming, whether the U.S. is about to escalate again. That framing misses what is actually happening on the water right now, which is quieter and in some ways more significant than another headline-grabbing strike. Since the war began on February 28th, with the strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader, the United States has cycled multiple carrier strike groups through this theater in a scale not seen in the region in decades. The USS Abraham Lincoln has been operating in the Arabian Sea since late January, running with Carrier Air Wing 9, its F-35Cs, its Super Hornets, its EA-18G Growlers for jamming Iranian radar, backed by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, including the Frankie Peterson Jr., the Spruance, and the Michael Murphy, each one carrying vertical launch cells stacked with Tomahawk cruise missiles. The USS George H.W. Bush was surged into the theater in the spring, specifically because a single carrier was judged insufficient pressure on Iranian decision-making. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the newest and largest carrier in the fleet, spent an extraordinary stretch of this war in theater as well, at one point approaching the longest continuous carrier deployment since the Vietnam War, before finally transiting home through the Mediterranean in May after its crew had been at sea for the better part of a year. That is the context that matters. This is not a Navy dipping a toe into the Gulf to make a point. This is the most sustained concentration of American carrier air power in this region in a generation, run continuously for 5 months, rotated rather than withdrawn, and still positioned today specifically because Washington does not believe the crisis is actually over. Every time a diplomatic breakthrough gets floated, whether by Trump on a Tuesday afternoon or by Iranian officials in Muscat, the ships stay exactly where they are. That is the real signal underneath all the noise. Diplomats can say whatever they want in front of a camera. The carriers do not move until the underlying military calculation changes, and right now it has not changed. There is also a piece of this that gets lost whenever the conversation turns purely to carriers and tomahawks, which is that the Navy's actual daily workload in these waters has very little to do with dramatic strikes and almost everything to do with unglamorous, grinding escort duty. Aegis-equipped destroyers assigned to these strike groups spend the overwhelming majority of their time not launching missiles at anything, but shepherding commercial tankers through a corridor where Iranian fast attack boats, naval mines, and shore-based anti-ship missiles remain a constant low-level threat. That mission has an actual historical name and precedent. In the late 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States ran an operation called Earnest Will, escorting reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through these same waters under the same basic logic, that commercial shipping needed an armed escort to move at all. What is happening right now is, in almost every functional sense, a modern version of that exact same mission, run at a scale and duration that dwarfs the 1980s original, because Iran's current arsenal of drones, mines, and coastal missile batteries is simply more capable and more numerous than anything Tehran fielded 4 decades ago. And the reason it has not changed is sitting in the numbers coming out of the strait itself. According to the International Maritime Organization, roughly 6,000 sailors remain stuck inside the Persian Gulf right now, unable to leave, 5 months after the initial closure. That includes around 24 crew members still aboard the MSC Francesca, a vessel Iran seized back in April and has not released. 6,000 human beings, mostly foreign nationals with no stake in this war at all, trapped inside a war zone because 2 governments cannot agree on who controls a 70-kilometer wide channel of water. Every one of them is a hostage to a negotiation neither side will admit is stalled. Layer the economic picture on top of that, and the pressure becomes even clearer. Brent crude rose again by roughly 2.7% in the most recent trading session, driven not by confidence that a deal is close, but by uncertainty about whether the diplomatic process is even real. Markets do not reward optimism when the 2 governments involved cannot even agree on whether they are talking. They price in risk. And the risk premium baked into oil prices right now is a direct, measurable cost being paid by every driver, every shipper, every airline, and every manufacturer on the planet. 5 months into a closure of a strait that, under normal peacetime conditions, carried roughly 1/4 of the world's seaborne oil trade and 1/5 of its liquefied natural gas. There is a regional dimension to this as well that rarely makes it into the American news cycle, but matters enormously to how this plays out. Every Gulf state bordering these waters, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, has its own economy wired directly into the assumption that Hormuz stays open. Dubai's airport has already had to deal with drone-related fires disrupting operations earlier in this war. Qatar has publicly called for freedom of navigation and a regional consensus on any future arrangement governing the strait, a diplomatic way of saying that Doha does not want Iran to be the sole arbiter of who gets to sail through international waters that border 6 other sovereign nations. Oman, for its part, has positioned itself as the indispensable go-between, hosting the deputy minister-level talks that both Washington and Tehran seem to need, even when they cannot agree on whether direct talks are happening at all. That triangular relationship, Iran needing Oman as a face-saving channel to the Americans, the Gulf states needing Oman to keep the oil moving, and the United States needing Oman as the only venue where anything resembling progress has actually occurred, is arguably doing more real work toward ending this crisis than any statement from either Washington or Tehran. So who actually blinks first in a standoff like this? Look at who has the most to lose from another 6 months of this exact status quo, and the answer is not close. Iran's economy has been absorbing the compounding cost of a closed or restricted strait since February, on top of a war that killed its supreme leader on day one and forced its military command structure to rebuild itself from a position of profound institutional damage. Every additional week that shipping companies route around Hormuz instead of through it, every additional week that Iran's own oil exports are constrained by the same instability it created, is a week Iranian leadership has to explain to a population already living through steep inflation and daily uncertainty about basic supplies. Rezai's hardline demand that Iran alone controls the route through its own waters is the position of a government trying to extract maximum leverage from the one card it still has left to play. But leverage only works if the other side needs the strait open more urgently than you need to control it. And that math gets worse for Tehran with every week the closure drags on, because Iran depends on that same waterway for its own oil exports every bit as much as the rest of the world depends on it for imports. Consider what Iran's own military establishment admitted just this past weekend. The spokesperson for Iran's regular armed forces, Brigadier General Mohammad Akraminia, said openly on state television that Iran had, in his words, fully exploited the earlier memorandum of understanding and ceasefire period to import new equipment, repair damaged systems, and produce new ones. That is a remarkable admission on its own terms. It confirms that every pause in fighting this year has been used by Tehran not as a genuine step toward peace, but as a window to rearm and rebuild capability that was degraded during the February strikes. Analysts tracking the internal Iranian debate describe a foreign ministry faction, led by figures like Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, that appears willing to accept limited compromises over the extent of Iranian control at Hormuz. But that faction does not currently hold the decisive vote. The Revolutionary Guard Corps faction, led by its commander, currently appears to dominate actual decision-making inside the Iranian security establishment. And that faction is the one publicly insisting, through voices like Rizai's, that Iran retain effective control over the waterway, no matter what economic price that costs the country. This is the split that makes predicting an outcome here so difficult. It is not simply Iran versus the United States. It is a diplomatic faction inside Tehran that wants sanctions relief and an end to the economic bleeding, competing against a hardline security faction that treats control of Hormuz as a matter of sovereign identity, not a bargaining chip to be traded away. Whichever faction wins that internal argument will determine whether the current ambiguity resolves toward a real deal or toward another round of strikes. And right now, based on the public statements coming out of Tehran, the hardline faction appears to be setting the public tone, even as quieter channels through Oman keep probing for room to maneuver. The United States, by contrast, can afford patience in a way it could not during the opening weeks of this war. The carriers are already in theater. The destroyers are already escorting what traffic does move. The naval blockade that ran from mid-April through late May already demonstrated that Washington is willing to physically interdict vessels attempting to bypass American enforcement, having intercepted dozens of ships and seized several outright before that blockade was lifted following the earlier round of negotiations. The infrastructure for pressure is already built and already sitting in the water. All that changes from week to week is whether Washington chooses to apply it more aggressively or continues to let the current uneasy standoff simmer while diplomats in Muscat try to find language both sides can sign without either one admitting they blinked. That is the real story behind a headline like Iran's worst nightmare, and it is worth being precise about what that phrase actually means. Because the honest version is less cinematic than the dramatic one, but far more consequential. Iran's worst nightmare is not a sudden new wave of airstrikes tomorrow morning. The worst nightmare for Tehran's military leadership is simpler and slower moving than that. It is the scenario where the current configuration simply continues, where the Lincoln and the Bush strike groups remain on station indefinitely, where the diplomatic track produces just enough ambiguity that neither side has to fully commit to peace or war, where 6,000 sailors stay stranded, where Brent crude stays elevated, where every week that passes drains a little more of Iran's already strained economic capacity without ever producing the single dramatic event that would let Tehran rally its population around a clear external enemy. A slow bleed is harder to survive politically than a single crisis, because a single crisis has an ending. A slow bleed does not. And there is a reason Iranian officials keep publicly insisting the strait is not actually closed, that it is merely restricted to vessels using what Rizai calls Iran's stipulated route. That framing lets Tehran claim it never surrendered control of the waterway, while simultaneously acknowledging in the same breath that normal international shipping still cannot move through freely. It is the language of a government trying to manage two audiences at once, the international shipping companies whose cooperation it still needs, and the domestic hardline faction that would treat any admission of full closure as an admission of strategic failure. Meanwhile, the Navy's posture answers a question that diplomatic statements from either government cannot answer honestly, which is simply this. Does the United States believe this war is actually over? The ships say no, not because any single new deployment order was issued this week, but because nothing has been ordered home either. A force this size, sustained this long, does not get maintained by accident or out of habit. It costs an enormous amount of money and puts enormous strain on crews who have already been at sea for extended stretches under wartime conditions. The only reason Washington keeps paying that cost is that its own military and intelligence assessment of Iranian intent has not shifted enough to justify standing down. So, where does that leave the next several days? Honestly, in a place that is uncomfortable to sit with, because it resists the clean narrative that any single headline wants to give you. Trump's claim of imminent talks may be real, filtered through Omani intermediaries in a way that lets both governments save face. Iran's denial may also be real, in the narrow sense that no Iranian official is boarding a plane to sit across a table from an American counterpart. Rizai's hardline statement about controlling the route is very likely the authentic position of the faction currently dominating decision-making inside Iran's security establishment. The same faction analysts tracking the Iranian government describe as unlikely to accept any arrangement that meaningfully reduces its control over the waterway. And the Navy's sustained presence is the most honest signal on the entire board, because unlike a diplomatic statement calibrated for a domestic audience, a carrier strike group cannot lie about where it is stationed or how long it has been there. Put those four things together, and you get a picture considerably more useful than any single breaking news alert. This is not a story about an imminent new strike. It is a story about an extended standoff in which both sides have convinced themselves they can outlast the other, and in which the actual human cost, 6,000 stranded sailors, a burning cargo ship off Oman with a missing crewman, Elevated fuel prices rippling through economies that have nothing to do with this war is being absorbed quietly while the two governments argue in public over whether they are even negotiating. The question worth asking is not when the next strike happens. It is how long either side can actually sustain the current arrangement before something breaks the stalemate, either toward a real agreement brokered through Muscat that both governments can plausibly claim credit for, or toward the kind of single incident, a struck tanker with casualties, a seized vessel that does not get released, an accidental engagement between an Iranian fast boat and an American destroyer that removes the ambiguity both sides have been relying on to avoid saying out loud who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz. There is one more angle worth sitting with before drawing any conclusion, and it has to do with what ordinary people inside Iran actually think about all of this, because their view complicates any narrative that reduces this to a simple two-government standoff. Iranian residents interviewed by local media in Tehran this week gave genuinely divided answers when asked whether renewed negotiations would help their country. One resident insisted Iran must keep control of the strait at any cost and never back down regardless of external threats. Another resident said there would be no problem with negotiations at all, provided they resulted in the United States having no ongoing military presence in the region as quickly as possible, adding that it would be wrong to assume negotiation itself is inherently bad for Iran. That split mirrors the split inside Iran's own government almost exactly. A population exhausted by 5 months of war and economic strain, divided between those who want the hardline posture maintained regardless of cost, and those who simply want the war to end on whatever terms make that possible. That divide inside Iranian society is ultimately the same pressure that Iran's leadership has to manage internally while it decides how long to hold its current position at Hormuz. A government can sustain a hardline foreign policy position for a long time if its population broadly supports the sacrifice involved. It becomes far harder to sustain once a meaningful share of that same population starts asking, in public interviews given to state-affiliated outlets, whether the sacrifice is even worth it anymore. That kind of visible ambivalence inside Tehran, showing up even in interviews conducted by Iran's own state media, is not the sign of a government operating from a position of total unified strength. It is the sign of a government trying to hold a hardline external posture together, while its own domestic argument about the wisdom of that posture is still very much unresolved. So, bring it all the way back to the question this entire situation ultimately turns on. Is the United States Navy's continued, sustained, unglamorous presence across the Arabian Sea and the approaches to the Persian Gulf actually Iran's worst nightmare? In the dramatic sense that headline implies, probably not, because nothing about a rotating carrier presence is new after 5 months of this war. But in the quieter sense, yes, absolutely, because the ships represent patience that Iran's fractured leadership may not be able to match. Every week the Lincoln and the Bush remain on station is another week of elevated insurance costs, stranded crews, restricted exports, and internal political pressure on a government that just admitted through its own military spokesperson that it has spent the ceasefire quietly rearming rather than genuinely preparing for peace. Until that answer arrives, the carriers stay where they are, the sailors stay stranded, and the ship burning off the coast of Oman tonight is simply the latest entry in a list that has been growing for 5 months, one nobody in Washington or Tehran wants to be the one to end by admitting what it would actually cost to blink first.